The morning Kate Kendrick climbed the scaffolding of the Millhaven church tower with a wrench in one hand and grief in the other. Every soul in that dusty Colorado town stopped what they were doing and stared. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Millhaven sat pressed between two ridgelines in the San Juan foothills like a coin dropped into a crack. The main street ran straight and unpretentious: a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge passed through, and a whitewashed church that had stood since 1864. The church had been the heart of the town once, but the bell in its tower had not rung in 14 months. A crack had split the iron casing just above the yoke back in the February of 1881, and ever since, Sunday mornings had been silent in a way that felt wrong, like a hymn missing its final note. Nobody had fixed it because nobody knew how, and the man who might have organized the effort, Reverend Aldous Green, had been ill since Christmas with a lung sickness that kept him bedridden. The deacons had written to Denver for a bell hanger. The bell hanger had written back to say it would cost $42 plus travel, which was more than the congregation's entire discretionary fund. So the bell sat cracked and quiet, and Millhaven went on without it, a little diminished, a little more tired than before. Kate Kendrick had arrived in Millhaven 3 years earlier with her husband, Thomas, who had staked a homestead claim on 40 acres of bottomland just east of town. Thomas had been a decent man, a hardworking man, a man who laughed easily and fixed things with a stubbornness that bordered on genius. He had taught Kate everything he knew about tools and leverage and the nature of broken things, because he believed a woman ought to know how the world worked. Then, in the autumn of 1881, Thomas Kendrick had ridden out to check on a section of fencing along the creek and had not come back. The horse had returned at dusk, riderless. They found Thomas the next morning at the base of a limestone shelf, where the horse must have thrown him. He had been 31 years old. Kate had buried him on the hill above the homestead, beneath a stand of cottonwood trees he had loved, and she had not cried at the funeral because she had already cried every tear she possessed in the 2 nights before it. After the service, she had gone home and fed the chickens and patched the roof over the henhouse because it had been leaking, and the women of the congregation had come to the door with casseroles and condolences, and Kate had thanked every one of them with a steadiness that frightened people a little. She was 28 years old. She had no children, no family within 400 miles, and she was alone on 40 acres of Colorado bottomland with a mule named Jeremiah and the memory of a good man. But Kate Kendrick did not fall apart. She did not sell the homestead and take the stage back east, as several people had suggested she ought to. She planted that spring, harvested that fall, kept her accounts in a small leather ledger with a precision that would have impressed any banker, and attended church every Sunday even after the bell went silent. She sat in the third pew from the front because that was where she and Thomas had always sat, and she sang the hymns clearly and without embarrassment, and she missed her husband in every quiet corner of every single day. It was on a Tuesday in late April that Kate had gone to speak with Deacon Harlan Moss about the bell. She had been thinking about it for weeks, turning the problem over in her mind the way Thomas used to turn a broken piece of tack in his hands, looking for the angle that made sense. She had read everything she could find about bell repair in the almanac, and in a mechanical handbook Thomas had kept on the shelf beside his Bible, and she had written a letter to a blacksmith in Durango who had answered her questions with more respect than she had expected. Harlan Moss had listened to her with his hat in his hands, and his expression somewhere between doubtful and embarrassed. He was 60 years old and had lived in Millhaven since before it was Millhaven, and he was a man who respected hard work in everyone but found it faintly alarming when it appeared in a woman in the form of ambition. "Kate," he had said, "it is a kind thought, but the bell weighs near 300 pounds and the scaffolding would need. I have spoken to Eli Farmer at the lumber yard," Kate had said. "He will provide the lumber at cost as a donation to the church. I know how to build the scaffolding. Thomas taught me. The crack runs along a line that can be filled with a cold iron patch if the surfaces are properly cleaned and the patch is fitted tight enough. The bell hanger's method is the same, except he charges $42 for the knowledge and I already have it. Harlan had looked at her for a long moment. It is not that I doubt your capability, Kate. Then what is it, Harlan? He had not been able to answer that in a way that satisfied either of them, and so by Friday the lumber had been delivered to the churchyard, and Kate had begun building the scaffolding herself, working from a diagram she had drawn on the back of a flour sack. She was methodical and careful, the way Thomas had always told her to be with structures that something depended on. She tested each joint and each board before she trusted her weight to it, and by Monday morning the scaffolding stood solid against the side of the tower, rising 12 feet to the belfry opening. That was the morning that Peter Cooper saw her. Peter Cooper was 34 years old and owned the largest working cattle ranch in the county, 700 acres of grass and creek bottomland called the Copperhead, after the copper-colored soil along the southern ridge. He was not a man who drew attention to himself with noise or spectacle. He was broad through the shoulders, lean through the jaw, with dark brown hair that had gone silver at the temples a year earlier than it ought to have, and eyes the color of creek water in November, that particular gray-green that is neither one thing nor the other but is, in its way, exactly right. He had come to Millhaven that Monday morning to collect a wire at the telegraph office, and he was riding down the main street on a bay horse named Captain when he saw the scaffolding against the church tower and a woman at the top of it. He pulled Captain to a stop. Kate Kendrick was working with a wire brush, cleaning the surfaces around the crack in the bell with a concentration that was visible even from the street. She had her brown hair pinned back under a wide-brimmed hat, and she was wearing a work apron over her dress, and she moved with the economy of someone who had been doing practical things with their hands their whole life. As he watched, she set down the brush, picked up a set of calipers, and measured the crack with a deliberateness that made his chest do something unfamiliar. Peter had known Kate Kendrick by sight and by name for 2 years, the way you know everyone in a town the size of Millhaven. He had attended Thomas Kendrick's funeral and had shaken her hand afterward, and he had thought then that she had remarkable composure and remarkable eyes. He had not permitted himself to think much beyond that, because Thomas had only been in the ground a day, and Peter Cooper was not a man who entertained thoughts that had no proper timing. But this, a woman alone on 12-foot scaffolding, calipers in hand, repairing a church bell that the entire congregation had given up on, this was something else entirely. He sat on Captain and watched for a full 3 minutes before he became aware that he was staring, and that was not something he made a habit of. He dismounted, tied Captain to the post in front of the telegraph office, collected his wire, and then instead of riding back toward the Copperhead, he crossed the street to the churchyard. "Mrs. Kendrick," he called up. Kate looked down from the scaffolding. She had a patch of iron grit on her cheek, and her expression was the focused, slightly impatient expression of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of measuring something. "Mr. Cooper," she said, not unfriendly but precise. "Is there something I can do to help?" he asked. She considered him for a moment the way she might consider a tool, assessing whether it was the right fit for the task. "Can you hold something steady while I work?" she asked. "I expect so. Then come up. Mind the third board from the bottom on the left side, it flexes more than I would like." He climbed the scaffolding with a care that told her he had respect for heights, which she found sensible. When he reached the platform beside her, she handed him the iron patch, a curved piece of cast iron that she had fitted and refitted at the Millhaven smithy over the past week, until the curve matched the bell's profile within a tolerance she found acceptable. "Hold that against the crack," she said. "Flat and firm. I need both hands for the bolting." He held it. The bell was enormous up close, larger than it looked from the street, cold and dark and smelling of old iron and something deeper, some accumulation of years and prayers and Sunday mornings. Kate worked with a ratchet and a set of iron bolts she had threaded herself, and she did not speak while she worked, and Peter Cooper did not speak either, because the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the particular silence of two people engaged in a shared task that demands attention. It took 40 minutes. When the last bolt was tightened and Kate had tested the patch with 3 careful taps of a hammer, she sat back on the platform and exhaled slowly. "That should hold," she said. "Will it ring true?" he asked. "The tone will be slightly different than before," she said. "A crack changes the resonance even after it is patched, but it will ring, and it will be heard." She looked at the bell with an expression he could not entirely read: satisfaction and something else, something quieter. "Thomas always said a thing does not need to be perfect to be worth doing. It just needs to be done right." Peter was quiet for a moment. "He was a good man," he said. "He was the best man I knew," Kate said, and her voice was level and clear and entirely honest. She did not look away from the bell when she said it. They came down from the scaffolding in the late morning light, and a small crowd had gathered in the churchyard. Harlan Moss and 2 of the deacons, Eli Farmer from the lumber yard, and a cluster of townswomen who had come to see whether what people were saying was true. Kate ignored them with a grace that was not rudeness, but simply focus. She began testing the bell rope, which she had also rethreaded the week before after discovering the original rope had frayed. The first ring cracked the quiet of the San Juan morning like a stone into still water. It was not a perfect ring. There was a slightly roughened quality to the tone, a small imperfection where the crack had been, but the sound rose and spread and carried over the rooftops and out across the foothills and into the clear April air, and every single person who heard it stopped moving for a moment. There was something in the sound, something that went past the mechanical explanation of iron and rope and resonance, that felt like an answer to something they had not known they were asking. Kate pulled the rope a second time and a third. The bell rang out over Millhaven, and the sound came back from the ridgeline as an echo, layered and warm. Harlan Moss took off his hat. Peter Cooper, standing 5 feet from Kate Kendrick in the morning light of the churchyard, felt something shift inside him that he could not have articulated to anyone and did not try. He only watched her, the plain, steady joy in her face as the bell rang, and he thought that in 34 years of living in the West he had not seen anything quite like this woman. That was how it started. It did not start with declarations or gestures. It started the way things start in practical places, with proximity and usefulness and the slow accumulation of small moments that do not announce themselves as important until much later, when you look back and realize they were everything. The following Sunday, the bell rang for the first time in 14 months, and Millhaven's congregation filled the church to capacity for the first time in nearly as long. Kate sat in her third pew from the front and sang the opening hymn, and 3 rows back and to the left, Peter Cooper, who did not come to Sunday services as often as he should have and knew it, sat with his hat on his knee and sang along badly and did not mind. After the service, in the bright May sunlight of the churchyard, people gathered around Kate to congratulate her in the way a small town congratulates someone who has done something for everyone. There was a warmth in it that was genuine, and Kate received it with a grace that was neither modest to the point of dishonesty nor proud to the point of performance. She thanked people and talked about Thomas's book on mechanical principles, as if the man who had taught her was the one who deserved the credit, which made several people cry quietly and look away. Peter stood at the edge of the gathering with his hat in his hands, and when the crowd had thinned, he walked over. "I wondered," he said, "if you might be willing to accept a dinner invitation. At the hotel, if you are comfortable with that, on no particular occasion, simply because it seems like the right thing to say." Kate looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "The right thing to say," she repeated. "Or the right thing to want to say," he blinked. Then slowly a smile crossed his face that changed his entire expression, younger and less guarded than he usually appeared. "Both," he said. She thought for a moment. "Thursday," she said. "The hotel dining room, 6 o'clock. "Thursday," he agreed. She nodded once, like the settling of a completed measurement, and walked toward the churchyard gate. Peter watched her go and then became aware that Harlan Moss was standing beside him with an expression of careful amusement. "Careful, Peter," Harlan said. "I am always careful," Peter said. "That," Harlan said, "is what makes it interesting." Thursday arrived with the particular beauty of a Colorado May evening, the sky going amber and rose above the ridgeline, and the air carrying the first real warmth of the season. Kate had put on her good blue dress, the one she saved for occasions that deserved it, and she had pinned her hair up with a set of bone pins that had been her mother's. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, and noted with the same honesty she applied to everything that she was a decent-looking woman who had never been vain about it, and did not intend to start. The Millhaven Hotel dining room was the town's best approximation of elegance, white tablecloths that had been white once, and were now a dignified ivory, candles in glass holders, and a menu chalked on a board that offered 3 choices each evening. It smelled of roasted meat and coffee, and the particular combination of wood polish and lamp oil that meant this was a place where people went when something mattered. Peter was already at the table when she arrived, which she noticed and appreciated because it told her something about him. He stood when she came in, which told her something else. He had made an effort. His clothes were clean and pressed in the way that suggested someone had pressed them specifically for this occasion, and he had trimmed the beard he usually kept short but not always tidy. "Mrs. Kendrick," he said. "Mr. Cooper," she said, and sat down across from him. They ordered the roast beef and the early potatoes, and the conversation began with the careful neutrality of 2 intelligent people who are not entirely sure yet what they are to each other. They talked about the spring planting season, about the price of cattle in Denver, about the telegraph line that the county had been promising to extend south for 3 years and had not. Kate talked about her plans for the homestead. She wanted to expand the kitchen garden and put in a proper root cellar before fall. Peter talked about a new section of fencing the Copperhead needed along the northern boundary, where the creek had shifted course the previous winter and taken a section of the old line with it. And then Kate said, "How long have you been alone on that ranch?" It was a direct question, the kind that could have been rude from someone else, but from her was simply honest. He met it with equal honesty. 5 years, he said. "My wife, Eleanor, passed in the winter of 1877, fever. We had only been married 2 years. "I am sorry," Kate said, and she meant it completely. "It changes you," he said. "Losing someone, it changes the geography of things. The way a room looks, the way morning sounds. Things you did not know you would miss, you miss." "Yes," Kate said. "That is exactly right." They looked at each other, and something in the quality of the silence was different from a polite pause. It was recognition. 2 people who had been through the same territory, different paths, but the same hard country. "I did not think I would do this," Kate said. "Come to dinner with someone, it felt for a long time like a betrayal. Of Thomas." "Does it feel that way now?" Peter asked carefully. She thought about it. "No," she said. "It feels like being alive, which I believe Thomas would have wanted, even if it took me this long to believe it too." Peter turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "He was a fortunate man," he said quietly. "We were fortunate," Kate said. "Both of us." They finished dinner and walked out into the May evening, and the sky above Millhaven was full of stars in the way that the high country sky gets on clear nights, so crowded with light that the darkness seems incidental. They walked along the main street in a comfortable companionship that was something new between them. Not quite friendship and not quite courtship, but something that contained the beginnings of both. At the corner where the road split toward the church on one side and toward the livery on the other, they stopped. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Cooper," Kate said. "Thank you for agreeing to it," he said. "And perhaps you might call me Peter." She considered him. "Perhaps you might call me Kate," she said. He smiled again, that smile that changed his face. "Good night, Kate." "Good night, Peter." She walked toward the livery where her mule Jeremiah was stabled, and he stood at the corner for a moment and looked up at the star-filled sky, with the feeling of a man who has found something he did not know he had lost. The weeks that followed were a gentle unfolding. Peter made reasons to come to town more often than the Copperhead's business strictly required, and Kate noted this and did not pretend not to notice it. They fell into the habit of meeting at Alderman's General Store on Saturday mornings, when Kate came in for her weekly supplies, and what began as exchanged greetings became conversations that stretched until the store's other customers had come and gone, and Alderman himself was finding things to do at the far end of the counter to give them the illusion of privacy. Peter began stopping by the homestead on his way back from checking the northern boundary of the Copperhead, which was not technically on his way back from the northern boundary, but was close enough that he could make the argument to himself with a straight face. The first time he stopped, he was ostensibly returning a horse blanket that he said he thought might be Kate's. It had been found near the fence line, but the horse blanket was clearly and definitively his own, and they both knew this, and neither of them said so. Kate made coffee, and they sat on the porch in the early summer warmth and looked out over her kitchen garden, where the early greens were already coming in. And the conversation was easy in the way that conversations are between two people who have both read a good deal and thought a great deal, and have been short of intellectual companionship for some time. Peter had strong opinions about the politics of the territory, and about the treatment of the Ute and Arapaho peoples whose land this had been before the settlers came, opinions that were more complicated and more thoughtful than most of his neighbors, Kate noticed. He was a rancher who had built something hard and real with his hands, but he was not a simple man. "The Homestead Act gave men like me an advantage they did not earn," he said one afternoon, looking out over the bottomland. "The land was here before us. The people who knew it best were moved off it so we could come in. I do not pretend that my 700 acres came from nothing." "What do you do with that knowledge?" Kate asked, because it was the obvious question. "I try to be a fair employer," he said. "I pay my hands a fair wage regardless of where they come from. I do not run cattle on land that is not mine. I have given a parcel of water access to 2 Ute families who were left without it when the creek rights were redistributed. It is not enough. It is never enough, but it is what I can do." Kate looked at him steadily. "Thomas said something like that once," she said. "He said that the measure of a man is not the size of the injustice he can see, but the size of the response he is willing to make." "Your husband was a wise man," Peter said. "He had his wisdom in practical things," Kate said. "You have yours in moral things. They are both worth something." Peter was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Kate, I would like to take you to the dance at the Grange Hall on the 14th. If you are willing." The Millhaven Grange dance was the town's main social event of the summer, a Friday evening affair with a fiddle player imported from Durango and a caller for the squares, and every family for 20 miles around came in for it. It was public in the way that small-town events are public, which meant that appearing there together would constitute a statement of some kind, visible to everyone who cared to look, which in Millhaven was everyone. Kate understood this perfectly. She considered it for 3 seconds. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The 14th of June fell on a warm evening with a slight breeze coming down from the mountains, and the cottonwoods throwing long shadows across the Grange Hall yard. Kate had worn the blue dress again because it was her best, and she had borrowed a shawl from her neighbor Ellen Paris that was embroidered with small gold flowers, because Ellen had insisted, and because Kate had to admit it was lovely. Peter was waiting for her outside the hall with his hat in his hand, and his expression, one of careful composure that cracked into genuine pleasure the moment he saw her. He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked into the Grange Hall together, and the room did exactly what a small town room does in that circumstance. It noticed, and it adjusted, and it went on, but it had recorded the information in the manner of a town that will discuss it thoroughly over the following weeks. They danced. Peter was not a graceful dancer, but he was a good one, attentive and solid, and not the kind of man who stepped on his partner's feet, because he was thinking about something else. Kate was better than him, which she had suspected would be the case, and she led when needed without making it obvious, which was a skill he recognized and was quietly grateful for. Between sets, they stood with cold lemonade at the edge of the floor and watched the room, and Peter told her about the summer he had spent in Abilene as a young trail hand before he had the money to start the Copperhead, and she told him about the year she and Thomas had spent in Missouri before they came west, and the stories of their younger lives intertwined in the particular way that means people are giving each other the significant portions of themselves. "You have never thought about going back east?" he asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious. "This is home now," Kate said, with a simplicity that was not resignation but something much stronger. "I planted things in this ground. Thomas is buried on that hill. The bell I fixed is in that church. This is where I belong." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, that particular look of his that meant he was feeling something he was still working out how to say. "Yes," he said softly, "I believe it is." The fiddle struck up a waltz, and he held out his hand, and she took it, and they moved onto the floor together in the warm light of the Grange Hall lanterns. In the weeks after the dance, the nature of things between them changed in a way that was subtle but definitive, the way a river changes when it rounds a bend. It is still the same river, but it is moving in a new direction now, and there is no particular moment of transition, only the clear fact of it when you look up and notice where you are. Peter came to the homestead more often, and the visits were less apologetically practical and more openly themselves. He brought her a book he had ordered from the Denver bookseller because he had read something she had said reminded him of it. A collection of essays on natural history that she read in 3 days, and then left on the porch for him with a sheet of paper tucked inside on which she had written her responses to 3 specific passages, because this was the way her mind worked, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. He had read her notes 3 times before he came back, and his conversation about them was the conversation of a man who had thought hard about what she had written, and Kate sat across from him on the porch steps in the summer heat and felt something unfold in her chest that she had thought was permanently folded shut. One afternoon in late July, she was mending a fence line along the eastern edge of the homestead, a section of cedar post and wire that the winter had loosened, and Peter appeared at the end of the lane on Captain, with his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He dismounted and came to where she was working without asking if she needed help, simply picked up the post driver she had set aside to restring a section of wire, and they worked together for 2 hours in the comfortable collaboration of 2 people who understand each other's rhythms. When they were done, sitting on the fence rail with water from Kate's canteen, Peter said, "Kate, I need to tell you something." She looked at him. His jaw was set in the particular way it got when he was working up to something, and she felt a small tightening in her middle, not quite fear, but the anticipation of something that would matter. "I am in love with you," he said. Not dramatically, not with great fanfare, simply and directly the way he did everything. "I have been for some time, and I have been trying to find the right moment, and I have decided there is no right moment. There is only this moment and all the rest of them that I would like to spend in your company." He paused. "I do not require an answer right now. I understand that things are complicated. I understand that you love Thomas and that love does not simply—" "Peter," Kate said. He stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. This man with the Creekwater eyes and the silver at his temples, and the moral seriousness, and the poorly hidden smile that changed his whole face when it appeared. She thought about Thomas because she always thought about Thomas when something important was happening, and she felt that particular quality of love for the dead that is not grief exactly but is close to it, the love that lives beside joy instead of it. "I know you do not require an answer right now," she said, "but I have one anyway." She held his gaze. "I love you too. I have been afraid of it for 2 months, and I am done being afraid." He exhaled as if he had been holding his breath since June. "Thomas would have liked you," she said. He would have argued with you about cattle prices and agreed with you about everything else. Peter laughed a real laugh, unguarded and warm. I would have liked that argument, he said. She smiled. It was a full, open smile, the kind she had not given anyone in a very long time, and it transformed her face the way light transforms a landscape. Nothing changed, but everything looked different. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was a careful kiss. The way a man kisses someone he intends to be careful with for a long time, and she kissed him back with the straightforward honesty that she brought to everything. And above them the Colorado sky was endlessly blue, and the fence they had just repaired stood straight and solid at their backs. But love in a small western town does not operate in a vacuum, and Millhaven had opinions, as Millhaven always had. The opinions were not, on the whole, unkind. Most of the town liked Kate Kendrick, and most of the town liked Peter Cooper, and a good portion of the town had been quietly hoping this would happen since the morning of the bell. But there were exceptions. There was a particular exception in the form of a man named Calvin Dre. Calvin Dre was 38 years old, owned a moderately successful lumber supply operation on the west end of town, and had been, in a loose and never formally stated way, interested in Kate Kendrick since her husband's death. He had brought casseroles. He had offered to help with the homestead repair more than once. He had not, to his credit or his frustration, ever pushed, because Kate had made it very clear without saying a word that there was nothing there to push toward. But he had waited, with the patience of a man who mistakes patience for entitlement, and when it became evident that Kate had chosen Peter Cooper, Calvin Dre became difficult. He was not violent about it. He was the kind of difficult that is harder to address than violence, the kind that manifests in snide comments at the general store, in the spreading of the suggestion that Peter had used his money and his position to take advantage of a grieving widow, in the quiet poisoning of social water that small-town jealousy excels at. Kate heard about it from Ellen Paris, who came to the homestead on a Wednesday morning with her knitting and her expression of loving concern. "People are talking," Ellen said. "Calvin Dre is talking. He is saying that Peter has been pursuing you since before it was decent." Kate set down the bowl she was drying. "Thomas has been gone for nearly a year," she said. What Calvin Dre considers decent and what is actually decent are two different measurements. "I know that," Ellen said. "I am just telling you what is being said." "What would you like me to do about it, Ellen?" Kate asked, not unkindly. Ellen looked at her knitting. "Nothing, I suppose. I just thought you should know." Kate told Peter about it that evening when he came by. He sat on the porch steps and listened with his elbows on his knees, and his face going quietly hard in the way it did when he was controlling something. "I will speak to Dre," he said. "You will not," Kate said firmly. "Because that would turn a small man's small jealousy into a public confrontation, and I will not have my name attached to a scene. I have never needed anyone to fight my battles, Peter. I fixed the church bell myself. I kept the homestead myself. I can manage Calvin Dre's opinion of my private life myself." He looked at her. "I know you can," he said, "but it is kind that you wanted to," she said, and her voice softened. "I am not dismissing that." "What will you do?" he asked. "I will continue to live my life in a way that makes his commentary irrelevant," she said, "which is what I have always done." And she did. She did it so thoroughly and so effectively that within 3 weeks, Calvin Dre's commentary had become an embarrassment primarily to himself. Millhaven watched Kate Kendrick go about her business with her usual steadiness, watched her attend church and sing clearly and greet neighbors with warmth and competence, and watched Peter Cooper go about his business in the same way, and the narrative that Dre was trying to construct simply had no purchase, because the actual story was too straightforward and too decent to be replaced by a sour one. Calvin Dre eventually moved his complaints to the saloon, where they diminished further, and then stopped altogether when he met a widow from Cortez at the county fair, and found himself with better things to think about. Summer moved into a deep, rich Colorado August, the kind of August where the afternoons are golden, and the nights are cool, and the mountains on the horizon look like something out of a storybook illustration. Kate's kitchen garden had come in abundantly more tomatoes than she could possibly preserve alone, squash climbing the fence posts, pole beans hanging fat and dark green. She had spent several evenings putting up preserves and was beginning to feel the particular pleasure of a pantry that is well stocked against the coming winter. Peter had begun spending Sunday afternoons at the homestead, which had become known to the town as a fact and accepted as such. He would come after the morning service, bringing something from the copperhead: a cut of beef, a dozen eggs, a jar of the dark honey his housekeeper misses. Ferris kept bees for, and Kate would cook, and they would eat together at the kitchen table or on the porch depending on the weather, and afterward they would sit in the evening light and talk or read, and sometimes they did not talk much at all, simply existed in the same space in the companionable quiet of two people who have found that silence together can be its own kind of richness. One Sunday in late August, Peter came to the homestead and found Kate sitting at the kitchen table with Thomas's ledger open in front of her and a pencil in her hand, and an expression on her face that he recognized as the one she wore when she was working through a problem that was not yet solved. "What is it?" he asked. She looked up. "The north pasture fence," she said. "The section along the creek. The cedar posts are in worse shape than I thought. I need to replace 12 posts before winter, and the wood and the hardware will run nearly $14, and I am $14 short of comfortable." She said it without shame, the way she said everything, but there was a tightness around her eyes that told him she had been sitting with this for a while. "Kate," he said. "Do not offer to lend me money," she said, reading him exactly right. "I will not take it. It would change what we are." He sat down across from her. "Then let me think about this the way you would think about it," he said. "Is there anything on the homestead you could sell before winter that you were not planning to sell?" She looked at the ledger. "The extra 2 heifers," she said slowly. "I was going to keep them through spring for the calves, but if I sold them now and replaced them next year," she did the figures quickly in her head. "Yes, that would cover it." "Eli Farmer," he said. He was talking at the store about needing heifers for his brother's operation in Dolars. He might pay a fair price. Kate nodded, writing in the margin of the ledger. "Yes, I will speak to him tomorrow." She looked up at Peter. "You did not give me the answer. You helped me find it." "There is a difference," he agreed, smiling. "That is why it works," she said quietly, meaning something larger than fence posts and heifers. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They sat like that for a moment in the kitchen that smelled of beeswax and coffee and late summer, and the afternoon light came through the window and lay across the table in a warm rectangle. And Kate thought that happiness, when it comes back after grief, comes back different, not smaller, but more conscious, more deliberate, more grateful. September brought the harvest, and with it the full weight of the season's work. Kate was up before dawn every morning, out in the garden and the field, preserving and drying and storing with an efficiency that was second nature. Peter was equally buried in the Copperhead's fall roundup, 2 weeks of long days on horseback, pushing cattle down from the summer range to the winter pasture, counting heads and managing the paperwork that accompanied the sale of 200 head to the Denver buyers. They saw less of each other in September, but the separation was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of two people who know the other is present in the world and will return, which is a different thing entirely from loneliness. Peter sent a note midway through the roundup with a smudge of trail dust on the paper and the words written in his strong, economical hand: "Counting the days until this mountain comes to Mohammed, or until Mohammed comes to this mountain. Am unclear on the geography." Kate had laughed at her kitchen table and written back: "The geography is settled. Come to dinner on Friday. I will make the apple cake." He came on Friday, trail-worn and satisfied, and she made the apple cake with brown sugar and cinnamon that made the kitchen smell like every good autumn that had ever existed. And they ate and talked, and he told her about a foal that had been born on the Copperhead that week, a chestnut with a white star, and she told him about the root cellar she had finally dug and lined herself, which he had not known she was doing and which impressed him in the specific way that Kate's practical competencies had been impressing him all summer. "You dug a root cellar," he said. 6 feet by 8, she said. "Cedar lining, hinged door. It will keep through February without frost damage." He shook his head slowly. "Kate Kendrick." "What?" she said, amused. "Nothing," he said, "only that you are the most capable person I have ever met." "Thomas would disagree," she said. "He once met a woman in Independence, Missouri, who rebuilt a steam engine from scratch. He talked about her for years." "The woman who rebuilt the steam engine and Thomas Kendrick are not present," Peter said. "You are, and I mean what I said." She met his eyes. "I know you do," she said. "Thank you." October came in gold and red, the cottonwoods along the creek throwing their leaves in great drifts that piled against the fence lines and needed raking every morning. The air had the bite in it that preceded real cold, and the mountains had their first snow on the upper peaks, white against blue in the way that still caught Kate's breath even 3 autumns in. It was on a Sunday in early October, after the morning service, the bell ringing clear and slightly rough-toned as it had every Sunday since April, that Peter asked Kate to walk with him after lunch. They went along the creek path behind the homestead, where the cottonwoods were at peak color, and Peter was quiet in the way he was when something was forming in him, and Kate let the quiet be because she knew by now what it meant. They came to a flat rock above the creek where they had sat before and watched the water, and they sat again, and the creek ran clear and low in its fall level, and the aspens on the far bank were pure gold against the gray sky. "I have been thinking," Peter said. "You are often thinking," Kate said. "About the future," he said. "About what I want it to be." He turned to look at her directly in that full-fronted way he had of facing things. "I want to marry you, Kate. I want to ask you properly, and I want you to know that it is not an impulse or a convenience or anything less than the most considered wish I have had in my adult life." He paused. "I know we have not known each other long by some measures. I know you have your homestead and your independence and that you have made a life here without anyone's help. I am not asking you to give that up. I would never ask you to give that up. I am asking you to share it with me and to let me share what I have with you, and to grow something together that neither of us could grow alone." Kate was quiet. She looked at the creek for a long moment, and he let her look. She was thinking about Thomas, as she often did at significant moments. She thought about his laugh and the way he turned things over in his hands and the hill above the homestead where he was buried. She thought about what he would say if he were here, and she knew, with the certainty that comes from having truly known someone, that he would say, "Be happy, Kate. Build something. Keep going." "Yes," she said. "I will marry you, Peter." He exhaled, reached into his coat pocket and produced a small ring, a gold band with a small garnet set in it, simple and well-made. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "My mother gave it to me when I came west, and I have never known what to do with it until now." She held out her left hand, and he put the ring on her finger, and it fit, which felt like the world being sensible for once. She looked at it for a moment, the small garnet catching the autumn light. "It is beautiful," she said. He kissed her there on the flat rock above the creek, with the cottonwood leaves falling around them and the water running below, and it was the kind of moment that becomes the kind of moment you carry for the rest of your life. The announcement was made in church the following Sunday, and Millhaven, which had been preparing for this announcement for months, received it with the collective warmth of a town that is glad to have been right about something. Ellen Parris cried. Harlan Moss shook Peter's hand for a very long time. The women of the congregation immediately began organizing what they called a bride's gathering, which was Millhaven's version of a wedding shower, and which Kate attended with the same grace she brought to everything, accepting the gifts and the warmth without embarrassment and without condescension, simply present and genuinely moved by the community's affection. The wedding was set for November, which some people said was too cold for a wedding, but which Kate said was the right time, because she had always loved the quality of November light in the mountains. Peter said he would marry her in January in a blizzard if she preferred, which made her laugh, and which was one of the reasons she was marrying him. Before the wedding, Kate went to the hill above the homestead on a clear October afternoon and stood at Thomas's grave for a long while. The cottonwoods were bare now, their branches making clean lines against the sky, and the grave was tidy under its simple limestone marker. She had planted a rose bush at its base the first spring after his death, and it had grown well, its stems now reddened with autumn. "I am going to marry Peter Cooper," she said aloud, because she had always talked to Thomas and saw no reason to stop. "He is a good man. He is different from you in most ways, but he is good in the same ways. He thinks about what is right and tries to do it, and he treats me as though my mind is worth something, and he makes me feel like myself." She paused. "I will always love you, Thomas. You know that. You are the reason I know what love is supposed to feel like. So in a way, you are the reason I recognized it when I found it again." She stood there for a while longer in the October quiet, with the wind in the bare cottonwood branches, and then she walked back down the hill to the homestead that she had built and kept and would carry with her. The wedding was on the 8th of November, 1882, in the church with the repaired bell. Kate wore a dress she and Ellen Paris had made together from a soft gray wool with white lace at the collar and cuffs, not a traditional white wedding dress, which she had deemed impractical for a Colorado November, but something that was its own kind of elegant. Her hair was pinned up under a small velvet hat that had been her mother's, and she carried a bunch of dried wildflowers and rosemary tied with white ribbon. Peter stood at the front of the church in his best coat with Harlan Moss beside him as his witness, and when Kate came through the door on the arm of Eli Farmer, who had offered, and whom she had accepted, because he reminded her a little of the older brother she had never had, Peter's expression did the thing it always did, the careful composure cracking into something unguarded and real that was better than any performance of emotion could have been. Reverend Green, recovered enough from his winter illness to be upright if not entirely robust, conducted the service with a warmth that made it feel personal rather than procedural. He spoke about the nature of love between people who had known loss, which was something he understood from his own experience, and his words were honest and not sentimental, and they landed in the church with a weight that was true. When Peter took Kate's hands and said his vows, he said them in his direct way, looking at her directly, not at the reverend or the congregation, only at Kate, as if the words were a private communication that the ceremony was simply witnessing. She said hers with the same quality, clear and certain and fully meant. The bell rang as they came out of the church into the cold, bright November day, and the sound of it over the San Juan Mountains was the sound of something completed and something beginning at the same time, which is the sound that bells make best. The congregation erupted in the particular joyful noise of a small community celebrating one of its own, and there was a reception at the Grange Hall with venison stew and apple cider, and dancing that lasted until nearly midnight, which was very late for Millhaven in November. Peter danced with Kate 3 times and with Ellen Paris once, and with the minister's wife twice out of politeness, and he watched Kate across the room for much of the evening with an expression that people who saw it did not quickly forget. She was talking and laughing with the same ease she always had, but there was something different in her tonight, a brightness, a fullness, as if she had expanded back into her own dimensions after years of holding a smaller shape. They rode to the Copperhead that night, which would now be Kate's home as well. She had made arrangements for the homestead. She would keep it. They had decided together, because it was hers and she would not surrender it, and they would use the land and tend it together. But the house on the Copperhead was larger and had more room for whatever life they were going to build, and Kate had spent 2 days the previous week moving the things she could not live without, including Thomas's book of mechanical principles, which she put on the shelf beside Peter's ranch accounts ledger. The Copperhead was a handsome ranch house, 2 stories of good pine with a wraparound porch and a view of the southern ridge that changed color with the seasons. Mrs. Ferris, the housekeeper, had lit fires in 3 rooms and left a supper set out on the kitchen table, and then had removed herself with the discretion of a woman who had managed a widower's household for 5 years and understood perfectly well when her responsibilities changed. Kate stood in the kitchen of her new home and looked at the table set with cold ham and bread and a crock of butter and 2 glasses and a bottle of wine, and felt the particular emotion of a moment that is both ordinary and entirely extraordinary. A kitchen table that is now yours, a fire that was lit for you, a life that has shifted its axis and landed in a new place. Peter came and stood beside her. "We can rearrange anything you do not like," he said. "The furniture, the rooms, any of it. This house should feel like yours." She looked at him. "It already does," she said simply, "because you are in it." He kissed her gently and then less gently, and the fire crackled in the hearth and the Colorado night pressed cold against the windows, and they were home. Winter settled over the San Juan foothills with its usual seriousness, and Kate settled into the Copperhead with the same practical thoroughness she brought to every new situation. She reorganized the kitchen stores within the first week, not because they were wrong but because she understood systems, and she found the existing one inefficient. Peter watched her do this with a combination of amusement and relief, the relief of a man who has been keeping a house running adequately but not well for too long. She took over the household accounts with the same precision she had applied to the homestead ledger, and within a month, the Copperhead's domestic expenditures were 15% lower than they had been without any meaningful reduction in quality. Peter examined her work and said, "You are remarkable," and she said, "I am simply organized," and he said, "These are often the same thing." She continued to ride out to the homestead twice a week to check on things, taking the mule Jeremiah, who had been brought over from the homestead stable, and had expressed his opinion of the Copperhead's facilities by attempting to bite Captain on their first meeting. The 2 animals had since reached a cold accommodation that was, Kate thought, entirely in keeping with the nature of mules and the nature of horses. Peter rode with her when he could, and they developed a pattern of working the homestead land together on those trips, checking fences, maintaining the root cellar Kate had built, ensuring the kitchen garden was properly put to bed for the winter. The homestead would be ready to plant again in spring, and Kate had plans for it that she had been sketching in the back of her ledger all winter. An expansion of the garden, possibly some fruit trees along the south-facing slope, a small orchard that would not produce for years, but that she was planting for the future with the particular kind of faith that is specific to people who plant trees. December brought Christmas, and with it the full warmth of Millhaven's community life. The church organized its annual service on Christmas Eve, and the bell rang through the cold night, and the sound of it carried further in the still winter air than it did in any other season, out across the dark foothills and up toward the snowed peaks, clear and slightly imperfect and entirely present. Kate sat in her pew, not the 3rd from the front now but the 5th, because that was where the Coopers had always sat and she was a Cooper now. And she sang the Christmas hymns with her full voice and felt the particular layered quality of the season, joy and memory and gratitude and the clean cold smell of pine boughs and the faces of people she loved around her. Afterward, in the churchyard, with the stars blazing in the winter sky, Peter put his arm around her and she leaned briefly against his shoulder, and they listened to the last of the bell's echo fade into the mountains, and it was enough. It was more than enough. The new year came in with a 3-day blizzard that kept everyone on the Copperhead indoors and gave Kate and Peter the particular intimacy of people who have to manage a crisis together early in their marriage and find out that they do it well. The cattle were brought into the lower pasture, the hay stores were checked and found adequate, the horses were in the barn, and the house was warm and stocked. They played cards by the fire in the evenings and read aloud to each other. She read to him from the natural history essays, and he read to her from a collection of newspaper accounts of the territory's political debates, and they argued about both with an enjoyment that was the enjoyment of two people who like thinking, and like the company of someone who thinks back. On the second night of the blizzard, Kate told Peter something she had not been certain of when the storm started. She had been suspecting it for 3 weeks, and now she was sure. She told him over supper without preamble because that was her way. "I am expecting a child," she said. Peter put down his fork. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him processing it, the information moving through him in waves, and the waves were all warm. "When?" he managed. "July," she said, "or thereabouts." He stood up from the table and came around to her side and knelt beside her chair in a way that seemed to surprise him as much as her, taking both her hands. His face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, open and full and young-looking. "Kate," he said. "I know," she said. "A child," he said, as if testing the reality of the word. "A child," she confirmed. He pressed her hands to his lips and stayed there for a moment with his eyes closed, and she looked at the top of his dark and silver head with a love so large it seemed to use more than the usual amount of space. "Are you well?" he asked, looking up. "Perfectly well," she said. "I feel very well, actually, stronger than usual if anything, though I am told that changes." "What do you need?" he asked. "Anything, tell me." "Right now," she said. "I need you to sit back down and finish your supper before it gets cold. And perhaps tell me what you are feeling, because your face is doing something interesting and I would like to know what it means." He laughed and stood and went back to his chair and looked at her across the table with the kind of full, clean happiness that has no performance in it. "It means," he said, "that I'm the most fortunate man in the San Juan foothills." "The entire foothills," Kate said. "Do not undersell it." He laughed again, and the blizzard pressed against the windows, and the fire was warm, and they finished their supper together in the new reality of a family that had been 3 weeks in the making. Spring came back to Millhaven with its usual extravagance, the creek running high with snowmelt, the meadows going from gray-brown to green almost overnight, the birds back in the cottonwoods before it seemed possible. Kate's pregnancy was progressing cleanly, and she was, as she had predicted, very well. She continued riding to the homestead until April, when Peter put his foot down in a manner that was equal parts concern and pure terror, and she agreed to restrict herself to the buggy because she was a reasonable woman, and because she had observed that his fear for her was genuine and unperformable, and she found it moving. She planted the orchard that spring, 6 apple trees and 2 pear trees along the south-facing slope of the homestead. In holes she directed and Peter dug, because he had agreed to the orchard the moment she described it and had thrown himself into the project with the enthusiasm of a man who also, it turned out, liked planting things for the future. The trees were small and the orchard was more promise than reality, but Kate walked among them in the May sunshine and looked at the straight young trunks and felt the patience in her that was specific to someone who understood growing things. "They will produce in 5 years," she told Peter. "Maybe 6 for the pears." "We will be here," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." June was long and warm, and Kate spent it in the comfortable tyranny of the final weeks of pregnancy, when the body becomes its own separate project requiring constant management. Mrs. Ferris was invaluable in ways that went beyond housekeeping. She had delivered her own 4 children and 2 of her neighbors, and had the calm, knowing competence of someone who does not find the natural world alarming. Ellen Paris came to the Copperhead every Thursday and sat with Kate, and they sewed and talked, and the women of the church brought food and advice, and the particular warmth of a community that closes around a new life, the way it had once closed around a death. Peter was, visibly, transparently, with no attempt at concealment, in a state of sustained anticipation that manifested as an inability to be in a different building from Kate for more than an hour at a time. His ranch hands teased him with affection. His foreman, a steady man named Diego Reyes who had worked the Copperhead for 6 years, told him without ceremony that the cattle would continue to exist regardless of whether he went inside to check on his wife, and that he was welcome to his worry but should not let it interfere with the branding schedule. The baby came on a morning in the third week of July, while a thunderstorm moved over the mountains, and the light outside was alternately bright and dark in the way of summer storms. It was a long labor, 12 hours, which Kate endured with the focused endurance she brought to difficult tasks, keeping her breathing measured and her communication with Mrs. Ferris efficient and her grip on Peter's hand when he was permitted to be present, something between affectionate and structural. The baby arrived in the late afternoon, into Mrs. Ferris's practiced hands, with the thunderstorm having passed and the sky gone clear and gold outside the bedroom window. It was a boy. Peter held his son for the first time with the careful, terrified reverence of a man holding something he is afraid of dropping, and looked down at the small, dark-haired face, and was completely undone in the way that only new fathers can be undone, without dignity, without composure, with the simple, shocking force of love that has no previous reference point. Kate watched him from the pillows with tired eyes that were entirely alive, the way eyes are after something enormous has happened, and she thought that this was the man she had chosen, and this was the life she had chosen, and it was right in every direction she could think to measure. "What shall we call him?" Peter asked, not looking up from the baby's face. Kate had been thinking about this. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Peter Cooper." Peter looked up at her. His eyes were bright in the way they got when he was feeling too much to process in an ordinary way. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas," she confirmed, "because he deserves to be remembered in the names of the things we make." Peter looked back at the baby. "Thomas Peter Cooper," he said softly, trying the sound of it. "Hello, Thomas." The baby Thomas opened dark eyes that were unfocused in the newborn way and seemed, in the purely subjective interpretation of two people in love with this small creature, to look back at his father with profound consideration. Millhaven heard the news before sunset news traveled by the speed of human excitement in a small town in 1882, which was faster than the telegraph in the cases that mattered. By the following morning, there were flowers on the Copperhead's porch from 3 different households, and Harlan Moss had rung the church bell himself as a celebration, which was a departure from standard procedure that everyone agreed was entirely warranted. The months that followed were the months of new parenthood, full and exhausting and lit from within by the specific illumination of watching a person come into being. Thomas was, it emerged, a serious and observant baby who studied the world with large dark eyes and expressed his opinions clearly when they needed expressing, and otherwise proceeded with an apparent philosophy of watching and learning that Kate found entirely relatable. "He is exactly like you," Peter told Kate. "He has your jaw," Kate said. "His thoughtful expression is yours," Peter said. "He has your temperament when he is hungry," Kate said. They had this conversation in variations for months, and both of them were right, which was generally how things went between them. Peter's relationship with his son was from the beginning one of those relationships that seemed to have an internal logic independent of anything the parent consciously constructs. Thomas responded to Peter's voice specifically, turned toward the sound of his footsteps, was quieted by being placed against his father's chest in a way that was not fully explicable by warmth or heartbeat alone, but was simply the particular resonance of those two beings in proximity. Kate watched this and felt a happiness that had different dimensions than any she had previously known. It was deep-rooted in the way of happiness that has been earned through difficulty, that knows the value of what it holds because it has held other things and lost them, and knows that nothing is guaranteed and chooses to be grateful anyway. She continued, through it all, to be herself. She was not the kind of woman who disappeared into domesticity, and Peter was not the kind of man who would have wanted her to be. She kept her homestead accounts and her kitchen garden accounts and her plans for the orchard in her ledger with the same precision she had always kept them. She went back to the homestead as soon as she was physically able, Thomas bundled against her chest in a carrying cloth of her own design, and she walked the rows of the orchard and checked the kitchen garden and inspected the fences. and she felt the same quiet pleasure in the land that she had always felt the pleasure of something that is cared for and therefore good. In the autumn of Thomas's first year, Kate was asked by Reverend Green, who was recovered now and full of the particular energy of a man who has been ill and is grateful to be upright, to speak to the congregation about the bell repair. He wanted to do a formal acknowledgement to mark the anniversary of the bell's restoration, and he asked Kate to tell the story. She stood at the front of the church on a Sunday morning in October with Thomas on her hip. He was 15 months old and had strong opinions about being set down, and she told the story simply and without embellishment. She told them about the crack in the iron, about the mechanical handbook, about the letter to the blacksmith in Durango, about the scaffolding and the calipers and the cold iron patch. She told them about Thomas Kendrick's belief that a thing does not need to be perfect to be worth doing, only done right. She told them about the first ring and the echo from the ridgeline. She did not tell them about Peter standing beside her on the platform holding the iron patch, because that was a private beginning and she wished to keep it that way. But everyone in the church who had been in the churchyard that April morning remembered it perfectly well, and Peter, sitting in the fifth pew with the particular expression on his face that was his version of everything, did not need it said aloud. When she sat back down beside him, Thomas immediately grabbed for Peter's coat buttons, which was his current method of processing interesting environments. Peter put his arm around Kate and she leaned against him in the church pew with the same brief, easy movement she made a dozen times a day, the movement of a woman who is exactly where she belongs. The bell rang at the end of the service, slightly rough-toned, imperfect, entirely present, and the sound went out over Millhaven and up into the October mountains and came back as an echo from the ridgeline, layered and warm. Time moved in the good direction. The orchard grew, unhurried and persistent. The homestead produced, and the copperhead thrived. Millhaven changed in the small ways that frontier towns change in the 1880s. A new schoolhouse was built in 1884, which Kate contributed both money and 3 weeks of labor to, because she believed that education was the most important building any town could build. A new family of Basque sheepherders came down from the north and settled near the creek, and Peter welcomed them as neighbors and introduced them to the community with a straightforwardness that set the tone for how the town treated them. Diego Reyes, the Copperhead's foreman, married a woman named Consuela from Taos in the spring of 1884, and Kate and Peter stood for them at the ceremony in the church with the repaired bell, and afterward there was a celebration in the Copperhead yard that lasted until stars showed. In the summer of 1885, Kate discovered she was expecting their second child. She told Peter over breakfast on a Tuesday morning with the same directness she had told him the first time, and he responded with the same unguarded joy, only quicker now, not less profound but more fluent, as if he had practiced receiving wonderful things and was better at it. This baby came in February of 1886, in a snowstorm that kept the doctor from making it in time but did not trouble Mrs. Ferris, who had delivered in worse conditions. It was a girl, a loud, definite girl with Kate's brown eyes and Peter's broad brow and the general demeanor of someone who had plans. They named her Alina Rose Alina for Peter's first wife, because Kate had suggested it and meant it, and Rose because Kate's mother had loved roses, and because the rosebush on Thomas Kendrick's grave had been blooming every year with the persistence of something that would not be interrupted. Thomas, who was 3 years old and had his mother's seriousness, inspected his sister with the methodical attention he gave everything and announced, after due consideration, that she was acceptable. Kate and Peter, exhausted and full of love, laughed until tears ran down their faces. The years settled into the shape of a life well made. Peter and Kate Cooper became what the people of Millhaven called, without irony or inflation, a good family, not because they were perfect or prominent or without difficulty, but because they were honest and hardworking and kind, and because their home was the kind of home that things grew in. Kate's orchard produced its first meaningful harvest in the fall of 1887, the apple trees coming in with a sweetness that the altitude gave to all the fruit grown on those slopes, a particular crispness that was different from lowland apples and better, in Kate's opinion. She and Thomas and Alina spent 3 Saturdays picking and pressing, and the cider they put up from that first harvest was drunk at Christmas dinner with the ceremony of a first. Peter lifted his glass and said, "To the orchard," and Kate said, "To patience." And Thomas said, with 3-year-old gravity, "To apples," and Alina, who was 18 months old and seated on the table with her father's hand bracing her, said nothing coherent but looked at her apple cider with considerable intensity. The church bell rang every Sunday and most special occasions, the slight roughness in its tone, a sound that Millhaven had come to love precisely because of its imperfection, the way you come to love a particular quality in someone's voice. New people who moved to Millhaven sometimes remarked on it, that slightly uneven quality, and old residents told them about the widow who had fixed it herself in the spring of 1882, about the scaffolding and the iron patch and the first ring that had gone out over the mountains. The story was always told with the same quality, not just admiration for the technical accomplishment, which was real, but something larger. Something about a woman who had refused to accept that a broken thing had to stay broken. Something about the particular courage of doing what needs doing even when convention says it is not yours to do. Something about love in the end, because the story always led to Peter Cooper standing at the edge of the churchyard that Monday morning watching a woman on scaffolding with calipers in her hand, and it always ended with them, which is the ending that makes the story worth telling. Kate herself, when she was asked about it in later years, and she was asked, because stories like that become part of a place the way landmarks become part of a place, always said the same thing. She said that she had not fixed the bell because she was brave or because she wanted anyone to notice. She had fixed it because it was broken and she knew how to fix it and it needed doing. She said that was all there was to it. But Peter, if he was present when she said this, which he usually was, would say quietly, "That is also all there is to courage, Kate, knowing what needs doing and doing it anyway." And she would look at him with the look she had been giving him for years, that direct, clear, fully present look, and she would say, "Perhaps." And the bell, if it was a Sunday, would ring. In the spring of 1888, Reverend Green finally retired, his lungs too tired for Colorado winters, and moved to live with his daughter in Santa Fe. The congregation hired a new minister, a young man named Reverend Paul Whitfield, just out of seminary in Denver, earnest and energetic and slightly alarmed by the West, who arrived in Millhaven in April and was immediately taken in hand by Kate Cooper, who explained the community to him with the efficiency of a woman who understood how things worked and what he would need to know. "The bell rings at 8 for Sunday service," she told him on his first day. "The rope was replaced in 1883 and should be good for another 10 years. If you hear a change in the tone, come to me before you call anyone else." Whitfield looked at her. "You are the woman who repaired the bell," he said. "I am one of the people who fixed the bell," she said. "Peter held the patch." "Mrs. Cooper," Whitfield said, with the slight awe of a 26-year-old encountering someone who is completely themselves, "I believe I understand this congregation better already." The summer of 1888 was a good summer, and the fall of 1888 was a good fall. And in December, Kate told Peter that there would be a third child in the summer of 1889. And Peter received this news in his now practiced way with love and joy, and the specific practical question of whether the house needed a third bedroom built before June. And Kate said yes, it did, and they began planning the addition the following morning. The addition was built in the spring, with Peter and Diego and 2 of the ranch hands doing the construction and Kate managing the project with a precision that Diego, who had worked with Kate for 6 years now, found entirely normal, and the two younger hands found extraordinary. The new room was finished by May, smelling of fresh pine and linseed oil, and the particular newness of something built for a specific future person. The third child arrived in July of 1889. A boy, strong and vocal, born in the new room on a summer morning while the Copperhead was at its most alive, the cattle in the summer pasture and the orchard filling in with fruit, and the kitchen garden in full production. They named him Daniel after Kate's father, who had died before she came west, and whom she still missed in the way you miss the people who made you who you are. Thomas was 7, old enough to be important, which he was solemn and careful with the new baby in the way that he was careful with everything that mattered. Alina was 3, and her opinion of her new brother shifted rapidly from suspicious to proprietary, and she appointed herself his primary supervisor, a role she would continue to fill for the next 20 years. Kate sat on the Copperhead porch on an evening in August of 1889, with Daniel sleeping in her arms and Thomas beside her on the bench with a book of natural history open on his knee, and Alina on the porch steps, arranging a collection of smooth creek stones in an order that had its own visible logic, and Peter coming across the yard from the barn with his hat pushed back and the last of the sun on his face. And she thought about the morning 6 years ago when she had climbed scaffolding with a wrench and a broken bell and the long work of grief, and she thought about how a life is made, the way all things are made, not in a single act of heroism or decision, but in the accumulated weight of small right choices, the choice to plant the orchard, the choice to go to dinner on a Thursday, the choice to stay. Peter came up the porch steps and sat beside her and looked at Daniel sleeping, and then at Thomas reading, and then at Alina and her stones, and then at Kate. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. He put his arm around her, gently to avoid waking Daniel, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the summer evening stretched out long and golden over the Copperhead and the orchard and the creek and the far blue mountains, and the bell in the Millhaven church tower stood in its repaired silence waiting for Sunday, slightly imperfect and entirely sound, exactly like everything worth having in this world. Millhaven grew, as frontier towns grow, with the particular mix of loss and gain that the West specialized in. Some families left, others arrived. The schoolhouse Kate had helped build filled with children from all the families within 20 miles, and Thomas Cooper was one of its first students, and Alina Cooper was another, and Daniel followed them in due time, each of them educated with a seriousness that their mother insisted on and their father supported without qualification. Kate continued her homestead with the disciplined care she had always given it, and the orchard continued to produce every fall, and the root cellar she had dug herself was eventually enlarged to serve the Copperhead as well, because it was better made than the one the Copperhead already had, which surprised no one. Peter went gray fully by the time he was 42, which he accepted with equanimity, and which Kate told him suited him, which was true. He expanded the Copperhead twice in 10 years, not from ambition exactly, but from the accumulation of good decisions and fair management. He paid his hands well. He maintained his fences and his water rights honestly, and he had a reputation in the county for being the kind of man you could deal with on a handshake, which in 1880s Colorado was worth more than most legal documents. Kate, approaching 40, was, as the women of Millhaven privately agreed among themselves in the affectionate way of women who admire someone without complication, unchanged in the essential ways. Still direct, still practical, still the person you went to when something needed doing. Still sitting in the 5th pew from the front on Sunday mornings, singing the hymns clearly, with Peter beside her and their children filling out the row in various stages of attention. The bell rang every Sunday, and its slightly rough tone had become, over the years, the signature sound of Millhaven in the way that a distinctive landmark becomes a signature of a place inseparable from the idea of it, loved for its specificity. People who had grown up hearing it and moved away said when they came back, that the first thing that told them they were home was the bell. Its particular voice, that slight roughness where the iron had been patched, was the sound of the town. On a Sunday morning in the spring of 1892, 10 years almost to the month since Kate had climbed the scaffolding, she came to church early while Peter stayed back with Daniel, who had a child's cold and was deemed insufficient for sitting still in a cool church for an hour. She arrived to find young Reverend Whitfield standing at the base of the bell tower looking upward with an expression of concentrated concern. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, "the bell is sounding a little changed this week." A rougher quality than usual. Kate looked up at the tower. Changed how exactly? More muffled perhaps, less resonant. Kate looked at him for a moment, and then she looked at the tower for a moment, and then she said, "I will need to look at it." Whitfield blinked. "I can send for. I know what I am doing," Kate said pleasantly, and went to the storage room off the vestry where she knew the short ladder was kept, because she had been maintaining this building in one capacity or another for 9 years and she knew where everything was. It turned out to be the rope housing, not the bell itself. A section of the pulley mechanism at the top had corroded through the winter and was muffling the bell's motion. Kate assessed it in 10 minutes, told Whitfield what parts she needed from the hardware store, and had it repaired before the congregation arrived. Peter came in with Daniel on his hip, the child's nose satisfactorily clear by the hour of the service, and found Kate in the third pew. She had sat in the third pew this morning for the first time in years, out of habit or memory or something that felt like both. He sat beside her and Daniel inserted himself between them in the determined way of 4-year-olds, and Peter leaned across the child and said quietly, "Did you fix something?" "The pulley housing," she said. "It was corroded." "I saw the ladder against the tower," he said. "It was fine," she said. "I did not say it was not fine," he said. "I said I saw the ladder." She looked at him, that direct, clear look. "I know how to fix a bell tower, Peter." "You know how to fix everything," he said. "I have been aware of this for 10 years. She smiled. "Good," she said. The service began. The bell rang clearer than it had the week before, the slight roughness that was its signature intact but the muffled quality gone, the sound true and carrying and full. It went out over Millhaven and up into the Spring Mountains, and came back from the ridgeline in its familiar echo. And Thomas Cooper, sitting on Kate's other side at 12 years old with his natural history book tucked under the pew bench, looked up at the belfry with the attentive expression of a boy who understood mechanisms and found them beautiful. Kate felt Peter's hand cover hers on the pew bench, and she turned hers over and held his. And Daniel, squeezed between them, announced in a stage whisper that he was bored, which made both his parents suppress laughter with the practiced ease of a decade of parenting. The light came through the church windows in long morning columns, and the congregation sang, and the bell's resonance was still in the air above the town. And in the fifth pew from the front, in the church she had given back its voice, Kate Cooper was exactly where she had chosen to be, surrounded by everything she had built and everyone she loved, in the country she had claimed as her own. With the man who had watched her from the street one April morning a decade ago and had never quite gotten over what he saw, which was, she thought, entirely correct. Some things should stay with you. Some things deserve to. The bell rang for the last hymn, and Kate's voice rose with it, clear and certain and full, into the Colorado morning.